Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with Neil Harvey, former chairman of the States of Alderney Policy and Finance Committee. We're going to take a look at changes since Neil stepped down in 2016. Neil, good to see you, and thank you very much for sparing me some time.
Good morning, Tony. It's quite like old times, isn't it? Nice to see you again. Last time I saw you was in the COVID shed, so I'm glad we both got out.
We both got out, and I actually got out of self-isolation last Sunday, having had my day 13 test as a negative one, but there we are. Neil, can we start off by having a look at what Alderney can do to contribute to the Guernsey deficit as a result of COVID?
Oh gosh, that's a big question, isn't it? I mean, obviously, Alderney's going through the ringer a little bit at the moment with the sudden change from 0 or 1 case for, I don't know, 18, 20 months to suddenly having double figure numbers. I think that was inevitable. It was going to happen at some point. I know there's a lot of noise on the social media about whether we've opened up too soon without sufficient vaccinations and testing. I mean, up until very, very recently, where we've been able to help Guernsey in particular has been through our staycation offering, which has been, I think, hugely successful. And I think that over that last 18 months, many people from Guernsey in particular have come to Alderney, and in some cases come back to Alderney, and have been so impressed with what they've experienced here. Guernsey would be a very isolated place without Hermsark and Alderney, and of those, obviously, Alderney provides the biggest offering. So I think we've helped during the COVID situation in that respect. We've helped ourselves in the sense of our economy. Certainly with absolutely no figures at all to back it up, but just the evidence of our eyes. Last summer, the island was very busy with people from Guernsey, and in the early part of this year has also been very busy. Difficult to detect much different from the normal levels of activity with the UK having been opened up in the past. So insofar as it helps our economy, obviously it helps Guernsey in terms of their tax take.
Yeah, but having said that, we can't physically provide additional funds because we effectively depend on them up to a point for subsidies in any case.
Well, absolutely. And of course, we have to remind ourselves we also share in their debt. Yeah.
So from that point of view, there is no answer, is there, currently?
I don't think so. I mean, I can't believe that Guernsey really believes that we're going to help bail them out in any meaningful way. But the stronger the Alderney economy, the better for the bailiwick and better for Guernsey and better for all of us as taxpayers.
Coming back to COVID, was it going to happen in terms of Alderney? I guess it was, wasn't it, really? We were very lucky for a long time.
I mean, as it happened with every jurisdiction, we have been incredibly fortunate. I guess we'd also say incredibly well led by Dr. Brinks, who's seemingly made all the right decisions at the right times in the past. But, you know, the idea of achieving zero COVID as a long-term objective, or certainly a medium-term objective, is just nonsense. It's not going to go away. At some point, we have to learn to live with it. Now, that point ideally would be when you had 100% of people vaccinated with a fully effective vaccine, which again is probably not something we can ever quite achieve, but it's certainly something to strive for. And I think we made huge progress in that respect. Certainly the most vulnerable people, the aging ones like you and I, got our vaccines in early, which is not much consolation to those who, through youth or otherwise, have not yet had vaccines. I fully appreciate that. And of course, it is those younger people who are mainly responsible for running the services and the retail establishments, hospitality, all of those things. So, you know, they, if ever there was a case, they're a vital part of the economy. Of course they are, absolutely. And I feel sorry for those who are still worried, whether they be young people unvaccinated or older people with other health issues.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy time, but it was going to be at some point we were going to have to open up. We were going to experience cases here. For those people who are suffering, again, I have no detailed information other than there appear to be none of them hospitalized, which is obviously a a huge plus point, particularly given our limited facilities. And I really do believe that while the vaccine may not be 100%, I believe it's pretty damn good, especially in the time it's been taken to develop it, an incredibly short time scale.
Yeah. No, I think everyone can take a lot of pleasure from the fact that they got on with it and came out with something that worked. And, this is on a worldwide basis, of course, as well. I suppose from the point of view of Alderney, it's good if it was going to happen, that it's happening during the school holidays.
Yes, I expect so. And again, there's a huge amount of evidence that young people are unlikely to catch COVID, or if they do catch it, they're unlikely to exhibit any symptoms, which is good for them. Perhaps not so good for those who might get it passed on. But as I say, I think it had to happen. It may be just a bit early for some people, but that we were never going to retain an entirely COVID-free situation. Just impossible.
Taking you back to your time at the States now, you were the chairman of PNF when the idea of Alderney taking over certain taxation, like TRP, for example, was to take place. That seems to have taken a long time to actually materialise. But where do you know where we are in terms of things like, for example, alcohol duty and stuff like that?
No, I think that's still in the future. The plan always was that tax on property, in a sense, the easiest tax to compute and to manage, would be the first step. It was intended to be, and I hope remains the intention. It's only the first step, and that beyond that we would move into issues of duty, which of course raises all sorts of problems and issues and exciting prospects of smuggling down the swinge. And so I think there are many in Guernsey who will be very nervous about Alderney taking control of alcohol duties and so on and so forth, being so close to them.
And presumably you'd need to have a bonded warehouse. So there's quite a bit of capital expenditure on something like that compared with collecting property tax. Yes,
although I understand that one of the off licenses, certainly in my day, who I think is no longer operating, he did have a bonded warehouse because he was bringing in duty-free alcohol. Some of it was going back out to UK sailors and flyers. So there was a bonded warehouse. Of its size, I have no idea. I didn't even know its location. It's probably a closely guarded secret, which is probably best on Alderney. So we, in a sense, we've been there before. But yes, there are quite a lot of complications compared with property tax. At least you can't shift your house or your retail establishment. You can't sort of do anything much with that other than just grin and bear it when the tax demands arrive.
Looking at the Guernsey-Alderney financial relationship, even though we're collecting the TRP for the states of Alderney, we still are not probably raising sufficient there to cover the costs of running the states of Alderney services.
I'm sure that's probably absolutely right. And certainly when we were looking at the figures in the mid 2015, 2014, it was clear there was a deficit, and still some argument about how much, even when you took account of all the taxes collected in Alderney, some of which, as you say, are now repatriated to us. At that stage, there was shall we say, a slightly natural suspicion of some of Guernsey politicians' motives. We could see that while we were striving for a degree of independence and the ability to say, well, our retailers have a footfall of about 100th of your lower polit retailers, therefore we should take account of that. There was still a feeling that, one or two politicians at least were thinking, well, here's an opportunity of unloading the whole shooting match on Alderney, and they will find out how much we subsidise them by, because, we might stop doing that. Again, I hope that's not the case. I would not have thought so. Certainly every sort of bit of intelligence I get is that the relationship with Guernsey States now is vastly improved on the situation that we had 5-6 years ago. And there is hopefully a degree more trust. I do think, and you could argue that the handling of the COVID situation, the vaccinations, the testing, where we have had, within reason, as good a service as Guernsey, albeit bigger and more facilities, we've had as good a service there freely offered and freely given by Guernsey. So I think that does indicate a degree of responsibility, if you like, for their smaller neighbour.
I mean,
and I would hope.
Yeah,
I say I would hope that at the end of the day, rationality would prevail, and if after collecting TRP and maybe some future point duties, it doesn't leave a huge amount left, that Guernsey will recognise that if there is a shortfall, there needs to be a plan to deal with it. That plan might take 5-10 years, which is not an easy timescale for politicians to cope with, but that's really what it needs.
2 elections.
Indeed. Well, as it stands at the moment.
Yeah, quite. Yes. Let's get on to the subject of cannabis regulation and tax. Now, I think a lot of people sort of jumped onto this as a great way of providing resource for Alderney and for themselves. But they've really approached this, in my view, on the basis that really you needed to have the regulation in place first before you actually started growing the stuff. What do you think about that?
Well, I should put my personal viewpoint forward, first of all. I think one of the things quite a few years ago that really struck me was when the UK's chief scientific advisor on soft drugs said to them, your policy isn't working. Decriminalising it would be the best thing you could possibly do. And they stopped listening to him after that. And he was their top scientific advisor. He said, we all know the statistics that soft drugs, yes, of course, there's the argument they're a gateway into harder ones. But that's a bit like saying you start with beer and you end up drinking whiskey. But certainly soft drugs kill a lot less people than alcohol, which is totally unlicensed. And it's probably an accident of history that one is allowed and the other is prohibited. So I suppose you could argue I'm a bit of a libertarian when it comes to that. It's not something I indulged in my teens. I was too busy doing other things, but we won't go into all of that.
I have to say I remember the 60s as well.
Well, there you are. You see, we obviously weren't indulging properly, Tony, were we? We weren't children of the 60s if we remember them. But no, I mean, I think I have quite a strong view that government's role is not to start businesses because they always end up going wrong. The government's role is to facilitate businesses, which they can mostly do by getting out of the way, by reducing the amount of unnecessary red tape. And sometimes it is necessary. I mean, we all knock health and safety, but there are good reasons for having a degree of health and safety regulation. And I think the same probably applies to the cannabis situation. We think because we are small and to a degree control our own destiny and can make our own laws, we could and should be able to move more nimbly perhaps than the leviathan of the UK economy, which dominates so much. So I think that there probably is an opportunity there, or there has been an opportunity there. But there again, we have to take account of our big brother down the road, where there is I think a natural tendency towards a conservative, no disrespect, but almost a Methodistic approach to such matters, as witnessed by the sometimes swinging sentences that people receive for using soft drugs for their own purposes in quite modest quantities. Again, I think it's historic, and I think it's starting to be questioned from what I read in the Guernsey press. One of the problems for Alderney politicians is we all come in bright-eyed and think, we will find that one brilliant idea that will transform the futures of the island. And I'm afraid it's a dream. It doesn't exist. Even probably the best idea Alderney has had in the last 20 years, the Gambling Commission. Of course, it wasn't a government idea. It was individuals who came forward with the idea. And I'm pleased to say at that time, the government said, yes, this is something worth pursuing against a bit of opposition in Guernsey. So again, it's a case of government getting out of the way of people trying to start legitimate businesses. So I'm not sure where we go from here on the cannabis thing. I mean, I walk over Essex from time to time, and I wonder what's being grown there this year, apart from weeds. But that's not for me to. I have an infinite knowledge of weeds and not so much of flowers. But
and that's not the colloquialism.
No. I think no. I think they are they are proper Alderney weeds.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
there may be some hemp or whatever lurking in there amongst it. Certainly last year it looked very neat and tidy, but
Yes. Yeah.
not quite sure what's happening this year.
No. The thing is, of course, that if they did take it on board and it got underway as an industry, you would have a situation where you could generate tax. Now, I believe that I read somewhere that Guernsey would automatically take that tax, but it would show as a bit of an offset to what we were talking about earlier, wouldn't it?
Well, it would. I mean, I'd prefer to see initiatives like that are very largely Alderney initiatives, albeit enabled by Guernsey, providing a direct benefit to our exchequer here.
Yeah.
We had some disagreements over the Gambling Commission money because those were license fees. Now, when I look back at the original 1948 Act, there was no cover, there was no mention of fees. It covered the taxes on duty and spirits and property taxes, but it was very narrow in its definition. You could argue, well, it also didn't agree that they should subsidise the airline to the benefit of Alderney because it wasn't envisaged at the time. But nevertheless, there was nothing in there that said that Guernsey, because it was that they should levy taxes on Alderney for the same taxes that were raised in Guernsey.
Yeah.
Well, there was no licensing fee income in Guernsey at that time. It hadn't been envisaged. So I discussed this with some of the Guernsey deputies, and in the end of it, one of the very senior deputies there, Roger Perrow, who sadly died, said, actually, you've got a point. It isn't covered by Guernsey, by the 1948 agreement, but there's no shadow of doubt that Guernsey was trying to lay claim to the Gambling Commission income, which, of course, at that stage was running regularly at £2 million a year. I think it's reduced a bit since. So we had quite a tough argument with them and the Treasury people there to say, look, we should have some of this. In the end, they agreed that we should have, I think it was £300,000 a year, which would roll up, which was useful as an economic development fund. Well, it was a quarter of a cake or a third of a cake, whatever. So it was a starting point. Unfortunately, and I don't know how it panned out, at a later date, they bullied a couple of our representatives into agreeing that AGCC, Gambling Commission income, would revert to Guernsey in the absence of the new relationship on financial matters coming to fruition. So it's a debatable matter whether they've reached that point or not, but there was a great danger that we would formally acknowledge Guernsey's right to that £2 million a year or any part of it.
Yeah.
And we always knew that, and I think that the head of the Gambling Commission, Andre, also realised that this was not a permanent stream of income you could look to for 5, 10, 20 years ahead. That changes in legislation in other countries, other jurisdictions, would mean they would gradually take over their own regulation, and that the AGCC, brilliant idea as it was, wonderful money spinner for a small island though it was, their income would gradually reduce. And we started to see that now.
We were lucky, weren't we, to get Andre on board?
Absolutely, first class individual. Great guy as well.
Yeah, really
very intelligent, very clever.
Yeah.
So that was a very smart move by whoever, well before my time, took those decisions.
Yeah. Let's get on to government reform. This is something we used to talk about regularly when you used to come on my show, and we don't seem to have got anywhere with it.
No, I think it is. I think it's very difficult. I mean, at that time I went back through the history of it, and I think the seminal report was a Home Office report in about 1995. Now, at that point, we had something like the present setup with the same number of states members, I believe, but they had about 25 committees, and some of those committees were doing the day-to-day running of the island. And quite reasonably, the Home Office said, this is ridiculous. This is not a role of politicians to be running, where which field the cows move into, today's sort of stuff. And considerable progress was made at that time. I think the first thing is there's absolutely no easy answer to this. People say, isn't it wonderful not to have political parties? Well, it is,
I thought that once.
In effect, you've got 10 political parties.
Yeah.
And there is insufficient benefit to any individual member from being a good team player if he wishes to get re-elected, because there is no collective responsibility. There is no sense of this state or 9/10 of it are really good and we must re-elect them on block, because it doesn't work like that. So as independents, they're all plying their own furrow. They're all doing, I'm sure, doing the best they can and doing the things they feel they can do to improve the island. But there just isn't enough premium on teamwork and collective responsibility. And I don't really know what the answer to that is. Playing with political parties, Jersey is moving more and more down that route, but then they have 50 times the electorate that we have probably. So we are really almost too small for political parties. I think you are a bit stuck with the present system, but changes could be made that would improve it. I think the first and foremost would be to stop this nonsense of having an election every 2 years.
Yeah,
I always think of the analogy: you give a small child a bean to plant in a pot, and 5 minutes later they want to dig it out to see if it's growing. Well, that's a bit the way we manage our politics here, because you are getting, at least in part, new states every 2 years, and it takes time for states members new to the job to understand how the whole thing works, or in some cases doesn't work. So it's an incredibly short time scale for the states to look at, to formulate, to assimilate, and to implement any medium to long-term plans, which is what we definitely need. So that's the biggest change. But these changes usually require an outside influence to make them happen. As I say, I think the Home Office report in the mid-1990s was largely accepted and largely implemented, but some of those things are still outstanding. We're still struggling with a policy and finance committee, the states in camera, as they say, comprising all states members, therefore insufficient public debate. I would like, in a sense, to create a small PNF, maybe three, 4 people tops, with no executive powers at all, but acting as a strategic body to actually formulate policies and seek their approval in the full states by the full states.
In public.
In public, absolutely, in the states meetings in the public gaze, because those debates need to be held in public. But most states members are too busy fighting their own corner. At the moment, of course, there's firefighting on all sides. There always was. I suspect some of the fires at the moment are a bit bigger than in my day, for which I'm very grateful I'm not having to deal with them now. So there's a huge amount of firefighting goes on, which makes it virtually impossible for many states members to consider, where are we going? Where are we going to be in 5? Where do we want to be in 5 or 10 years' time? And those, when I was in banking and I used to meet a new customer, well, one of the early questions was, well, you've got a good business here, hopefully, but where do you see it in 5 and 10 years' time? Yeah. And some had thought about it, and most probably hadn't, because they're living day to day, and that's very much how our states works, I think.
Yeah. The big problem that they seem to have, and, I've interviewed a few of them over the years, is the fact they don't realise that the role as the legislature in terms of scrutiny is very, very important. And so, if you went for your idea of, say, 3 or 4 on PNF, similar to Guernsey, of course, you then have a situation where they can take matters to the states can debate it, the states can decide whether or not they want it. And it would flow a lot better if you actually saw the separation between the executive and the legislature.
Yes, I mean, I know this issue of scrutiny has come up before. I mean, I would argue that this island probably has about 1,000 people on scrutiny committee, because everybody has a view.
As an opinion,
as our politicians are so accessible, and people on Alderney are not usually backward in expressing their views. The other point, I think, is that I think the civil service, particularly the top end, have 2 very, very important roles. Everybody sees them as being the implementers of decisions and policy, which is quite right and proper. But they should also be there to act as at least in a legal sense, a check and restraint on ideas and plans that might be coming forward from politicians. I always saw the chief executive's role as saying to politicians, well, you've got a great idea about doing this, but actually what you're trying to do is either illegal or certainly not consistent with human rights or what Guernsey is expecting of us. So the chief executive does need to provide a degree of restraint on the politicians, as well as implementing the more sensible decisions. I'm not sure. People say it's a very small civil service. I keep hearing of people doing different jobs, so I'm not sure how big or how small it is at the moment. But when you have I used to look upon it, as I said to you many times, this is a bit first like a parish council on speed is Alderney, but then what parish council has to manage a harbour? What the range of things that our states are responsible for is pretty enormous, really. Even though it doesn't include the airport or the air operator at the moment, but pretty much everything else is a responsibility of the states, and that's a huge breadth of responsibility, particularly as every little area of responsibility now has its own mountain of regulation and things that we are required to do to be good citizens and part of the British Isles and common travel area and all those things. So it's a hugely demanding job on a very small island. And we always expect to have more in terms of services. And yes, most of us have come from the UK. Thank heavens we're no longer there. But we still remember that you could pick up a phone and get someone to do this, or you could go somewhere and sort out your issues, travel, business, whatever. It was easy with the vast infrastructure there. It's just not possible on a small island. But the compensating benefits are enormous, and I wouldn't change it for a minute.
States haven't got a very good record for retaining CEOs. Why is that?
Well, I think there is one of my old bosses used to refer to constructive tension always between the politicians and the CEO. Very difficult one, this, because obviously politicians, they're all doing a good job by their own lights. Some of them are thinkers. Probably rather more of them are doers. And if you're a doer, you want to be getting on and doing it yourself. You don't want some civil service saying, chief executive saying, that's my job, my people will sort that out. If you feel you know this island better than them and you could get on with it and sort it out. So there is a degree of that. I've been involved in a couple of selection panels in the past, and we chose the best candidate. We always thought we chose the best candidate that was available to us. But until they get here, you can tell them till you're blue in the face, look, you've come from a big local authority or a big this or a big that. You've had support staff coming out of your ears. You could have been light years away from the people who actually, you're governing, because you very rarely get to see them. Forget all that, because here in Alderney you're going to have to wash up your own dishes, and you're going to be seeing the people who pay your salary every day in the street. It's such a different situation that however much you tell them that's how it is, until they experience it, they're not going to perhaps fully understand the claustrophobia, if you like, at times, of being on Alderney. Plus, some of them come in and think, well, we've got these politicians here, they'll come and go, and I will just do what I think is right. That again is going to bound to lead to certain problems, and it's a very difficult role to be chief executive of somewhere like this. We've always brought in outsiders, and there's very good reasons for doing that. Might be interesting sometime to try an insider, mightn't it? But I doubt whether the civil service in Guernsey would accept that.
True. Let's get on to let's get on to aviation. The public service obligation has finally been signed off. You're pleased to see that, because we've got a guarantee for 5 years.
I am. I haven't actually seen it. I don't know whether anybody
hear of
has.
it.
It would be very interesting to actually see what. And the first word of it suggested ought to be a public document, didn't it? It's a public service obligation. I don't know whether it has been published anywhere. I haven't seen it. It would be quite interesting to see what it says. Yes, I think so. I mean, when we were down to about our last 5 or 6 Trilanders long ago, and I said to people, you've got to accept this is as good as it's going to get. It's going to go downhill from here on. They said, no, we'll have cheaper flights and better flights and all the rest of it. Well, Unfortunately, you know, the old saw about how do you get a small airline? You start off with a big one, and just let it happen. But I am pleased. I mean, whether it's Alderney rumour or whether it's been some clever policy to alarm people in Alderney that the Southampton route would go, particularly as it did do for a long time under COVID for understandable reasons. You know, is this part of a softening up exercise? You know, are we going to have to put everything through Guernsey, which I think would be pretty disastrous for our economy in normal circumstances. So yes, I was pleased to see that there is a commitment for 5 years to provide us with that Southampton route and continuing Guernsey route. That there is a price on it, well, that's inevitable. You can't keep going on with, you know, the overdraft is going up and up, which a lot of it, I gather, was carried on overdraft, the cost of Alderney, guaranteed by the states, obviously. So that they put a finite number on it, and I believe a minimum obligation in terms of flight numbers, although it will be interesting to see the detail of that, is a good step forward. I mean, I try to move in that direction in my time in the States with fighting against quite a bit of resistance in Alderney and Guernsey states for what was then a service level agreement. The problem with all these agreements is when you're dealing with a state-owned entity is, you know, what are the penalties? Because if you fine them, it's just going to increase your commitment on loans or whatever. Yeah. So unless you can tie it into some board remuneration or longevity issues, there are not too many levers that you could pull as compared with an obligation for an outside third-party agency. So, you know, I pushed for the service level agreement. Initially, Gavin St. Pierre rejected, then eventually said, well, if you want to negotiate one with Alderney, go away and do it, but don't include us. Well, that would have been totally pointless, as he well understood. So in the end, we did get a service level agreement. People said it hasn't got any teeth. No, it had very limited teeth. But what it did do was it got us into a greater dialogue, both with the states of Guernsey and with Alderney under its then management. So at least it served a purpose in respect of creating a dialogue, and also in starting to pin Alderney down to some service level agreements, because up until then it had been apparently entirely at their whim what level of service we got. We know they scrapped any idea of waiting lists, and I said to them, look, if you sell out for a whole week, you know, in a summertime, what do you do about it? Well, we'll think about it next year. Well, sorry, but that's not really a satisfactory answer for us. So I think it perhaps started the process going, even though it got signed up by everybody and then immediately gathered dust on a shelf somewhere. I suspect if we were offered the service levels included in that now, would take their arm off, but they'd probably say, well, that's now no longer 2 million, it's 3 or 4 million. Yeah. At the same time, I said, look, we have got the Gambling Commission money. We have an agreement here with Alderney, which gives us a minimum level of flights. I think we should be negotiating for more, but we're going to have to either pay for it or at least underwrite it as the states of Alderney. And at that stage, we had the money, we could have done that. Yeah. That didn't go down terribly well with some of my colleagues who said, well, that means we're paying them twice through the tax and the direct subsidy. I said, well, yes, but, you know, you're not going to get the extra flights unless we do something like this. And of course, we did actually run the trial with the direct flights to Jersey. It was quite late in the year. I think it was September, October. And the only way we could persuade him to do it was that we would effectively take a charter. And we did that charter for, I can't remember what it was now, about 6 weeks. And with minimal lead-in time, you know, those flights were running about 80% full. And we certainly washed our face on the charter. And we were talking about what we would do the following year. This was in the Trilander era. And of course, the following year, they decided to scrap the Trilander fleet, and the whole thing went rather pear-shaped. Yeah, so there we are. So essentially, as I understand it, they're prepared to subsidise it up to £2 million a year. Obviously, if we run out of subsidy, Alderney would have to put the fares up. Yes, I mean they what I've read, and it's all third-hand stuff. Yeah, course. Sure. But what I've read, they're saying that, you know, we can provide this level of service for a subsidy of £2 million a year. But we haven't got the aircraft or the air crews, or we don't plan to have them to do any more than that. So whether it's physically possible for them to do more than the minima required laid out in the PSO, I don't know. I mean, it's always possible to do it if you have to. We eventually, when they were having trouble with the Dorniers in the early days, we did, with a meeting with Gavin and Mark Darby, we did manage to bully them into chartering this lot thing, which I sort of look upon as being a Eastern European agricultural version of the Dornier, where the Dornier had aluminium bits and this, that had sort of steel or iron constructions. But it was a very similar aircraft. And in a moment of crisis, when they had no Dorniers operating, it did run
the
from
business
for several weeks.
Yeah.
So they under enough pressure, we eventually managed to get them to come up with at least half a solution to a crisis situation, which otherwise they would just have said, well, I'm sorry, but there's no flights for the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever.
What about the runway? Are you in favour of a longer runway? But lots of people say to me that if you lengthen the runway, it's got to be widened. You've got to have security fencing. You've got to have a scanning facility. You've got to have a new terminal. 50 million quid is a figure that somebody gave me.
Yeah, well, there's an awful lot of nonsense talked about the whole thing. What I am in favour of, Tony, is having a runway, and that has been under threat over the last several years. I mean, we had such discussions with Guernsey and with the Director of Civil Aviation. We eventually got the DCA to admit that he'd spoken to colleagues in the UK who'd said, well, we have worse runways in the UK that we license, but not many. And it really is. I mean, it's been a close to a disaster, and how we have managed to avoid any accidents is really beyond me, because coming into our very narrow, quite short runway on a wet and windy night is so demanding of the pilots. It's probably demanding more than we should really be doing. The problem over the surface has been known about. Year after year, we were told, well, we're going to do something about your runway. Our minimum requirement was always that it go back to the full width, because the grass bits had to be excluded, otherwise it would have become unusable in rain, because of the technicalities of landing distances and what have you. So they had to go down to the narrow tarmac section only, and obviously the state of it breaking up, surface level breaking up. We got into all the load bearing issues and the concrete strength issues, and it was very clear to all of us that something needed to be done pretty urgently, or we would lose the runway altogether. And they've been continuing to patch it ever since. I gather now they're doing a sort of fairly halfway refurbishment with the contractors' vans all over the place at the moment. Should we have a longer one? Well, we all got terribly excited when we had a meeting with Malcolm Cooper, then commercial director, who said, well, of course, if you want cheaper fares, you need ATRs. So we said, well, yeah, but we can't take ATRs. He said, well, but if you could take ATRs, and gave us some numbers in terms of, what impact that would have on fares. And people then started getting very excited about the prospect of bringing in ATRs, getting lower fares. It was immediately apparent, of course, that the service levels in terms of numbers of flights we'd be getting to achieve any break even, at least on an ATR, would be a very significant reduction in the number of flights. We have to say, well, which is more important, to have 2 flights a day or 2 flights a week? That might be cheaper. So it's all a trade-off and all a balance. Now, the current philosophy seems to be that because no airline wants to run a mixed fleet, and God knows Alderney's got a very mixed fleet at the moment, they will make savings. Obviously, if they could drop the Dorniers and just work with the ATRs, they would make significant savings there. Whether those significant savings would be anywhere near enough to pay for the considerable expense of a wider, longer runway with, as you say, some facilities, not necessarily a huge terminal, whether those savings in Alderney would pay for that over a 10 or 15-year period, I'm dubious. So I'm a bit of a doubter on the longer runway, but I do accept the argument that planes have been getting bigger And if, as I say, you want to future-proof our runway for 10, 15 years ahead, which is what they should be looking at, it would make sense, all things being equal, to have a runway capable of taking slightly larger aircraft.
Yeah.
So, I am in favour to that extent, but not to the extent that, our service levels drop down to, 2 or 3 flights a week. And I think the proposal has been that with a modest extension, they could bring in a half full ATR. Well, how long are they going to want to be flying half full ATRs? What are the economics of a half full ATR flying?
Don't work.
Well, you wouldn't want to do it too many times a week, would you? I don't think
you'd put that to Mr. O'Leary, would you, and get away with it?
Well, you wouldn't, would you? And there's always things you can learn from the private sector. Some things, but not everything.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I am enormously relieved that Alderney is still state controlled.
Yeah.
Because I think without that, we would be in a much, much darker place. Okay, so we're paying an arm and a leg for through the taxation system to retain it. I'm told, I don't know, I've not met the new chief executive and chairman, but I'm told they're how can we say this without being unkind to their predecessors?
Pretty clued up.
People. Very competent people.
Yeah.
I always thought that there had to be a mechanism with Alderney as regards states control to get them under some financial controls and to get them under some sort of qualitative controls. And I'm sure there are plenty of consultants around the world who could come and spend a week with an airline and say, actually, you've got far too many ground stuff, or you haven't got enough this, or some expert running the rule over it rather than just being told by the chairman or the then chief executive, oh, everything's fine, give us another 3 million. Yeah.
We're getting a bit short on time, I'm afraid. But one thing I'd like to ask you in conclusion is this question about the marina. Now, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing from your perspective? Does it provide effectively instant cash flow?
Well, the cynic in me, Tony, says if I turn this iPad through 90 degrees, you will see a very large pile of papers. Those are marina plans going back to God knows when. Probably the Victorians. I joined the Marina Advisory Group a couple of years or so before I stood for the state, because I really thought this would be good for Alderney, and I still think it would be good for Alderney. It would be good for the economy. I joined the states then and said, we must push this ahead. And all the cynics said, we've been talking about this for 30 years. It's never, ever going to happen. So I desperately trying to avoid saying the same thing as all those cynics said to me. But again, the problems are pretty significant. In those days, we went out to, I think it was about a dozen marina operators and developers around the south coast of England. We sent them a very detailed package of where Alderney was, what we were trying to achieve. Were they interested in talking to us? And there was a resounding silence from about 10 out of the dozen. The couple who came back really were more interested in providing us with consultancy services than a marina, because that's a no-risk way forward. And as a sailor of many years, I would love to be able to park up my boat in the winter and step ashore and go. A marina here will not necessarily be a moneymaker in its own right. There's an apocryphal story of, I think it was our then harbour master went to London Boat Show, and Sunseeker came along and said, look, you build a marina, we'll fill it up with our boats. We can guarantee you to fill it up. Now, if that had been a South Coast marina, they'd probably have taken their arm off. But how would that benefit us? We would have a marina that was full of large boats that probably got used once or twice a year. The benefit to the economy, there would be some benefit, but pretty minimal. Our view always was that you need the right mix in a marina like this. You need probably about maybe 20%, a third local boats, a third of these long-term residents with their fairly large gas guzzlers, and at least a third available to visiting yachts, because that's where the benefit to your economy in terms of the local spend will really come from. Probably the most thoughtful report we had on the whole marina thing, very detailed report, was done by Halcro Engineering, and they came up with various options. I think the cheapest of which was about £25 million. And that was 10 years ago, so you can imagine what that might be now. it's an incredibly harsh environment to build a marina. The actual marina bit is easy and simple, and probably £1 million or so. It's the sea defences. You only need to go out into around Bray Beach, Bray Bay, where the strong northeaster blowing, not even necessarily in wintertime these days, to see the power of the sea there. And that's what you have to defend against, not for 5 years, 10 years, but 50 years or more. So it's an extremely expensive thing to do. You have to look at the credentials of the people who are bidding and what they're trying to achieve. I think it's inconceivable that a marina could be built anywhere in the south of England or in the Channel Islands without a degree of residential development, because that's usually what
the quid pro quo
pays for the infrastructure.
Sure.
And that again is contentious, even if the proverbial fairy godmother turned up with 25 or 30 million and said, I'll build you a marina, which I think would have to be in Bray Bay. There's no other sensible option, either over under Fort Albert or up what you call the blacksmiths up at the western end of the harbour. There would still be a significantly vociferous part of the population who would say, we don't want to spoil the views, the natural amenity, whatever. So there is, we're no different from anywhere else. There is always a resistance to change from certain people. Now, if the politicians at the time and the planning process are robust enough to withstand that for the greater good, as they say, then fine. But I'm not certain they would. And at the moment, we haven't got that fairy godmother. So I think the difficulties of not just the physical difficulties, the financial difficulties, but the social and community difficulties of building a marina here. I wouldn't put too much money on it, Tony, much though I would dearly love to have one. And I think it would be good for the island. I mean, when you look at Alderney, there are so few natural advantages we have. We don't have any great natural resources other than the tidal streams. The two things we have in our favour are our location at the entry to the Bay of St. Malo, which certainly works for anybody boating. I should just give a little plug here, as I'm a director of the Bird Observatory. It's also brilliant for the migrant birds passing through here. We are unique in the British Isles in our location there. So you have to take advantage of your natural assets, your USPs, if you like. Tidal energy is one that's gone away. I'm glad we haven't got onto that today. Another day, maybe.
You're not going to get away with that lightly.
Voters coming down to all the joys and beauties of Normandy and Brittany, and the migrant bird population. Those are some incredible benefits we have of where we are.
Yeah, but there we are. Neil, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for sparing me some of your time. And we'll have another session perhaps a bit later on in the year.
Thank you, Tony. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Right, you still there?